Zoro has a rival problem, or rather, a lack of rivals problem. One Piece is a story about a lot of things: adventure, mystery, but also strength. A huge part of Luffy's journey is about surpassing all of his pirate rivals in order to become the Pirate King. But when you look at Zoro, the second lead of the story, his goal is literally a simplified version of Luffy's. Becoming the world's strongest swordsman is not about wealth or fame, it's purely about power. What Luffy and Zoro's goals have in common is that they both must surpass all of their rivals and reach the peak of strength in their respective fields. But here's the problem: while Luffy has accumulated dozens of rivals throughout the series, Zoro has 0 rivals, 0 fellow swordsmen who share his dream of becoming the world's strongest swordsman. The entire world's strongest swordsman competition is only a 2-man race between Zoro and Mihawk, with no other rivals in between. This lack of competition doesn't just hurt the world building, but it hurts Zoro's character, because without rivals, Zoro has no checkpoints on his journey, nobody to challenge him other than himself. So in this video, I'm going to break down what actually counts as a rival for Zoro's character, and why none of Zoro's past opponents fulfill this role. Then I'll explain why the world of One Piece is overflowing with pirates who are chasing after the Pirate King title, but almost no swordsmen are chasing after the world's strongest swordsman title. So if you're interested in any of that, be sure to stick around to the end of the video, where I'll give my take on how Zoro could have had more rivals, who they should have been, and how this could have improved Zoro's character and the story as a whole. Before I go through each of Zoro's opponents and explain why they don't work as rivals, we need to define what a rival means in the first place. The definition of a rival is someone who is competing with another for the same objective or for superiority in the same field of activity. For many shonen rivals, this field is strength. Both characters are competing to be stronger than one another. We see various examples of strength-based rivalries in One Piece, but in most other manga, this type is typically seen between the protagonist and the deuteragonist. While I personally consider Zoro to be the deuteragonist of One Piece, I'm not saying Luffy and Zoro should have been rivals. Oda has already tried his hand at the Luffy-Zoro rivalry in the Whiskey Peak arc, and the fight between the two is arguably one of the worst writing decisions in the entire series, as I explained in my previous video. I think the reason why the Luffy-Zoro rivalry doesn't work is, for one, their fighting styles are too different. In fact, blades and cutting attacks are functionally Luffy's weakness, so the two can never truly be comparable in strength, since their fights will be very matchup dependent. But also character-wise, Luffy and Zoro are similar enough to each other when it comes to honor and ambition to motivate each other, but for Luffy, strength is just a means to an end, whereas for Zoro, strength is his end. Luffy and Zoro have similar journeys, making them ideal partners, but their goals are completely distinct and don't conflict at all, which is why they don't work as rivals. After Oda scrapped the Luffy-Zoro rivalry in Whiskey Peak, he immediately pivoted to the Zoro-Sanji rivalry in the following arc, which has now become a staple. Sanji cares even less about strength than Luffy does, and he doesn't even have the kingly ambition like the two conquerors of the crew do. But the reason why the Zoro-Sanji rivalry still works is because Zoro and Sanji are rivals when it comes to their ideas of honor. Both Zoro and Sanji place a huge importance on honor, but Zoro's honor comes from an Eastern Bushido warrior ethic, while Sanji's honor stems from a Western chivalrous code. One is based on passion, the other is based on stoicism, making them naturally conflict. Oda has stated that the samurai Ryuma from his Monsters one-shot was the prototype for Zoro's character, and in his early sketches we even see a knight by the name of Romeo who could have been Ryuma's rival. So perhaps Sanji was initially meant to be a swordsman rival for Zoro, but then Oda switched out his swords for guns, but eventually settled on the kicking fighting style that we know him for today. The honor-based rivalry of Zoro and Sanji survives from the original design, which manifests in the two competing in terms of strength, hunting, insults, and bounties as well. But what has been lost is someone who can challenge Zoro when it comes to his fighting style, his craft. What Zoro lacks is someone who he can compete against who shares the same goal as him, a rival swordsman. Throughout the story, Zoro has had many opponents, but not all of them have been swordsmen. This makes sense, since Zoro isn't sailing around looking for opponents like Mihawk. He's following Luffy first and foremost, so Oda makes sure that not all of Zoro's opponents happen to be swordsmen for the sake of realism, as most of them are just the number 2 of the organization that the Straw Hats just happen to be fighting. But since this is a pirate manga and swords are such a common weapon in this setting, at least some of Zoro's opponents just happen to be swordsmen as well, allowing Oda to develop Zoro's subplot along the way of Luffy's main story. While most of Zoro's scuffles are against non-swordsmen, Oda makes sure that almost all of his main opponents use swords to one extent or another. But the problem is, very few of Zoro's opponents actually care about the art of swordsmanship, and absolutely none of them share Zoro's dream of being the world's strongest swordsman. Zoro's opponents like Mr. One, Pika, and even King to an extent, aren't really swordsmen. Sure, Pika technically has a sword, but he mostly only fights in his giant statue form. And while Mr. One can turn his body into blades, he's not really a swordsman, he's an assassin who's kind of like the anti-swordsman in a sense. Fundamentally, these guys serve more as physical obstacles for Zoro to test his strength against, rather than rivals who can contest him in terms of swordsmanship. Even King and S-Hawk test Zoro's swordsmanship more through their durability rather than with their own swordsmanship. Characters like King and Kaku actually do use their swords in their fight against Zoro, but swordsmanship is only a small part of their fighting style. For Kaku, his Rokushiki and Giraffe Fruit play equally as big of a role, and for King, his Lunarian Flames and durability is the biggest piece, along with his Pterodon Devil Fruit. King doesn't even seem to consider himself a swordsman, and it might be because he doesn't primarily use a sword, but it also might be because of his honorless fighting style. But what actually defines a swordsman in One Piece is a whole nother issue that deserves its own video. Perhaps you can consider Kaku Zoro's rival, because he's the only swordsman Zoro fights multiple times, but the definition of a rival is two people vying for the same goal, and Kaku seems completely disinterested in becoming the world's strongest swordsman, which makes sense given that he's an undercover agent for the government and he's a genuinely chill guy, so he has no use for that type of notoriety. Likewise, Killer also seems like an ideal rival candidate for Zoro, as he's the only other supernova that wasn't a captain and he uses blades as well. We got a short fight between the two in the Wano arc, but Killer wasn't really in his right state of mind and neither had their ideal weapons. But Killer's Punishers definitely aren't swords, so Killer can't really be a swordsman rival for Zoro. Kid and Killer could have been good rivals for Luffy and Zoro when it comes to piracy as a whole, but going into why that fell apart also deserves its own video for another day. The Zoro fight that feels the most like a fight between two rivals to me is the Zoro vs Ryuma fight, as I think it's the purest sword duel Zoro has gotten throughout the series since Mihawk himself. The reason why I still wouldn't consider Ryuma a proper rival for Zoro is because technically it wasn't Ryuma who fought Zoro. Zombies typically take the personality of the shadow but the identity of the body, as if Brook was cosplaying Ryuma. Sure, Zoro fought against Ryuma's blade and physical strength, but it was Brook's technique and personality at the end of the day. If anything, this fight would have been set up for Brook to be Zoro's rival, but we never see the two ever compete when it comes to swordsmanship, and Brook hasn't shown any interest in becoming the world's strongest swordsman. Ryuma's title seems like it can go even farther beyond Mihawk's title as the so-called God of the Blade, so I'm not sure if you can consider Ryuma to be Zoro's rival when it comes to their goals, but he does rival and challenge Zoro when it comes to his swordsmanship, which is the most important part. This fight was also relatively short and forgettable compared to Zoro's other fights, but that's by design. Thriller Bark as a whole is less important and is a self-contained arc, but it also served to set up larger and more important arcs like the Wano arc, so I think Wano should have been the place where Zoro fought his greatest rival, second only to Mihawk. Funnily enough, the other opponents that are the closest to serving as Zoro's rivals are also his weakest, the fishermen Hachi and Hyozo. Hachi and Hyozo are relatively weak compared to Zoro at that time in the story, but they at least had some pride in being swordsmen. They didn't seem to care about becoming the world's strongest swordsman, but they did keep track of their internal ranking within Fishman Islands. Two people isn't really a lot of competition, but if you think about it, it really isn't less competitive than the strongest swordsman competition in the One Piece world as a whole, because for most of the story, it really is just Zoro and Mihawk. There are only a handful of characters in One Piece who actually care about the title of the world's strongest swordsman. Obviously you have Zoro himself, and maybe you can also count Mihawk too, as he probably sought after the title in the past before he got it, and intends on keeping it to this day. But outside of these two, there are only two other characters who have ever shown interest in Mihawk's title. The first is actually Zoro's only true rival in the entire series, and that's Kuina. In the past, Zoro and Kuina had fought each other thousands of times, and promised to each other that one of them would become the world's strongest swordsman. So Kuina definitely fits the role of a rival. The problem is that she's currently a bit too dead to be Zoro's opponent in the main story. In the modern day, the spiritual successor for Kuina is Tashigi, and some even theorize that Tashigi is related to Kuina or is actually Kuina somehow. But even if Oda's trying to carry on Zoro and Kuina's relationship through Tashigi, what has been lost is their rivalry. Tashigi's goal is to take back every legendary blade from bounty hunters and pirates alike, which is extremely ambitious, but it's also extremely unlikely that she'll be able to do it with her own strength. Tashigi has also stated that she will train and get stronger, but she and Smoker have fallen so far behind Luffy and Zoro that it's unlikely that we'll get a proper fight between them from this point on. Tashigi technically doesn't have to fight every swordsman herself to retrieve their blades and achieve her dream, but even if she does, that makes her an enemy of Zoro rather than a rival that is striving for the same goal. The only other named character that is gunning for Mihawk's title and is alive in the modern day is Vista of the Whitebeard Pirates. Vista is the only other character besides Zoro who we've seen duel against Mihawk. Mihawk fans will probably like to forget this moment because it's a huge downscale for him, but world building wise, Marineford is the only arc where it actually feels like the world's strongest swordsman is a title that other swordsmen strive for. Vista widens the world's strongest swordsman competition from 2 to 3 competitors, which is not a lot but is a huge jump. But this doesn't really do much for Zoro's character directly because Vista isn't an opponent for Zoro. And after Marineford, we never see Vista on screen again, which I think is a massive waste and something that I'll amend at the end of this video. So while a good proportion of Zoro's opponents have been swordsmen, none of them besides Mihawk himself share Zoro's dream of becoming the world's strongest swordsman. And the only 2 characters who share Zoro's dream aren't Zoro's opponents in the main story. But why? Why is the goal of One Piece's second most important character so neglected, especially when you compare it to Luffy's? Throughout Zoro's journey, he has fought just as many non-swordsmen as swordsmen. Likewise with Luffy's journey, he's fought just as many non-pirates as he has pirates. So not every opponent that Luffy and Zoro fight can be their rival when it comes to their goals. But compared to Zoro, the design structure Oda chose for Luffy's opponents is a lot more intelligent. It makes sense that as the protagonist, Luffy would have much more rivals than Zoro. One Piece at its core is a pirate manga, and its world is designed to accommodate the most pirate characters as possible. But because it is a pirate manga, swords are also one of the most common weapons in the story. Some of the strongest characters of all time use a sword as their primary weapon, including the Pirate King himself. So shouldn't there be just as many swordsmen who want Mihawk's title as there are pirates who want Roger's? Well, the reason why there isn't might be because the Pirate King title is broad and vague enough where almost every pirate can go after it. Becoming the Pirate King isn't purely about strength like becoming the world's strongest swordsman is. Before he became the Pirate King, Roger was already the strongest pirate around, only being rivaled by Whitebeard. But he only became Pirate King after he successfully circumnavigated the Grand Line and found the One Piece. While power is all that is needed to become the world's strongest swordsman, becoming the Pirate King requires allies and territories, wealth and fame along with power. That's why even Mihawk admitted that Luffy's goal was even more ambitious than Zoro's goal of defeating himself. Finding the One Piece treasure is what cemented Roger as the Pirate King, but what that treasure is still a mystery, which allows every pirate to project their wildest fantasies on it. So even weak and washed up pirates like Don Krieg and Buggy can still compete with Luffy, as they believe that finding the One Piece is the shortcut to becoming Pirate King. So it makes sense that less people are going after Mihawk's title than the title of Pirate King, as the One Piece is an extrinsic, tangible reward. On the other hand, Zoro's goal of becoming the world's strongest swordsman is an intrinsic personal goal, and doesn't come with any other tangible benefit other than fear and notoriety. And I think this is most likely why even Roger was never considered the world's strongest swordsman. After Rox was defeated, Roger technically should have been unanimously considered the world's strongest swordsman, as the only other people who can possibly contend with him were Whitebeard, Garp, and Sengoku, who don't use swords. It's much more likely to me that this title was invented for Mihawk, and becoming stronger than every other swordsman is a goal that he's personally set for himself. Mihawk isn't really a pirate like Roger and Shanks, he's a swordsman first and foremost. He isn't really the type to sail around looking for treasure or crewmates. Mihawk's only goal is to find opponents to test his swordsmanship against. We know Mihawk had duels with pirates like Shanks, but going as far as challenging even Marines is likely what got him labeled as a pirate in the first place and given the title of Marine Hunter. This is very similar to Zoro's title of Pirate Hunter, back when he was hunting bounties before joining Luffy as a pirate. This just shows swordsmen can exist on either side of the law, and the priorities of a swordsman and a pirate are two separate things. Now how this manifests when it comes to hockey and swordsmanship and the Shanks vs Mihawk debate is a topic for another video. The point is that even dreaming about the world's strongest swordsman is rarer than dreaming about the Pirate King. For a pirate like Luffy and Blackbeard, strength is merely a means to an end to attain their true dreams. But swordsmen like Zoro and Mihawk value strength for strength's sake. Strength itself is their end. So while it makes sense that Luffy would naturally have more rivals than Zoro, what doesn't make sense is that Zoro has no rivals at all, especially when you consider how important rivals are to both of their journeys. Unlike Zoro, Luffy has accumulated dozens of rivals on his journey to become the Pirate King. Some sources would consider characters like Kobe and Smoker as rivals for Luffy, but technically they should be considered his enemy. An enemy is someone who stands against the character in the way of their goal, while a rival is someone who stands parallel with the character and competes with them for the same goal. One Piece is complex in this sense, because there are good and bad pirates and marines alike, meaning that Luffy gets along with some of his enemies better than he does with his rivals. Luffy and Kobe, just like Roger and Garp, have a friendly relationship, but at the end of the day it's a marine's duty to capture pirates, making them enemies. Likewise, Luffy and Blackbeard's goal don't contradict with each other. In fact, a lot of their worldview is the same. There's no inherent conflict that stops pirates from teaming up, as we've seen with the Rocks Pirates and the alliances of the worst generation. Luffy and Blackbeard only have animosity because of Ace and personal differences. As pirates, the only reason why Luffy and Blackbeard would fight is because both of them are competing for the one same goal, becoming Pirate King. This distinction between rivals and enemies may seem trivial, but it creates a big difference between how these two types of antagonists are written. You see, One Piece fans are still split on who they think the final villain will be, but it always comes down to Emu and Blackbeard. This is because Blackbeard and Emu represent the two opponent archetypes Luffy has, rival pirate and government enemy. The overarching design of Luffy's journey to become Pirate King is twofold. When it comes to pirates, each faction is knocking each other off in a tournament-like fashion, so Luffy must defeat every pirate rival to progress. And we know inevitably it will come down to Luffy vs Blackbeard as the championship match for the prize of the One Piece. On the government side though, Luffy must defeat every government enemy starting at the bottom of the hierarchy with lowly marine captains like Axe-Hand Morgans, all the way up to the top brass of the Marines and then the world government that sits on top of it. I personally believe that becoming the Pirate King is the prerequisite for Luffy to be able to challenge the world government, which makes Emu the clear final villain, but the point is that while these two plotlines are intertwined, they're both distinct and well thought out design structures that allow Luffy to have both enemies and rivals in the story. When it comes to Zoro, distinguishing his opponents between rival pirates and government enemies is pointless, since his story has nothing to do with becoming Pirate King or taking down the world government. In fact, this means that unlike Luffy, Zoro can have rivals in the world government arcs as well, as their affiliation doesn't really matter as long as they're swordsmen. Zoro's main priority is to help Luffy become Pirate King, but more importantly to his character is his subplot to become the world's strongest swordsman. Narratively, Zoro's subplot serves to supplement Luffy's, as his climb to the top of his domain when it comes to swordsmanship mirrors Luffy's climb to the top of his domain to become the king of the pirates. Zoro's goal is like if you stripped away every other aspect of Luffy's dream and isolated the strength aspect, of surpassing all your rivals to become the greatest. But because Zoro's goal is almost purely strength focused compared to Luffy's, even the tournament style progression in the pirate world isn't linear enough for Zoro's story. The competition to become Pirate King is very hierarchical and linear, but even in this tournament format, there's a subjective aspect to each one of the rivalries. Each one of Luffy's rivals share the same goal, but they each have different dreams and ideologies that interact differently with each other, and that is reflected in their devil fruits, which are also diverse and match up uniquely with each other. The reason why Zoro doesn't have a devil fruit and will never get one is because he must surpass all of his opponents to become the world's strongest swordsman objectively. Having a devil fruit that is powerful against some opponent but not others won't help him in his journey. In fact, it would hurt Zoro by not allowing him to grow as a swordsman. We don't want Zoro to beat Mihawk by exploiting a weakness or because of a certain matchup difference. We want Zoro to win entirely because he has become a superior swordsman. So now we're reaching the problem with a lot of Zoro's opponents. Oda is a little bit too creative with their unique abilities, but he's not consistent enough with what they all have in common, which is swordsmanship. Sure, it's fun to have some diversity within the different sword styles in One Piece. I mean, Zoro's 3-sword style must have some different strength and weaknesses compared to Mihawk's great blade. And things like Kinemon's Foxfire style seems like a small quality of life skill that wouldn't be such a big deal if Mihawk doesn't have, but it wouldn't be the sole determiner of the fight. But Zoro figuring out the gimmick to an ability does not move him forward to defeating Mihawk, and therefore doesn't progress him in his journey at all. So despite how much people love to praise the more subjective, matchup dependent power scaling of the pre-time skip, a more objective, DBZ style linear progression is actually what is optimal for a part of Luffy's journey and the majority of Zoro's. So the problem really isn't that Zoro's opponents don't share the same dream as him, because that's really the symptom. The real problem is the reason why they don't share the same dream as him is because none of them are actually swordsmen first and foremost, the same way that Zoro and Mihawk are. If most of Zoro's main opponents were swordsmen and were willing to compete with Zoro when it comes to swordsmanship, that would make them actually proper rivals for Zoro's character. And I think a small fix like this would have a huge effect of making Zoro's subplot so much more interesting and effective. This video is not to say Zoro is a bad character or I would have done a better job at writing him than Oda. I only started this video series because I think Zoro's character and his storyline has a lot of potential besides being badass and loyal. Zoro seems to have a lot less depth than the rest of the Straw Hats, but that's only if you measure depth by emotional moments and sad backstories. Take a manga like Vagabond for example, where Musashi has so much depth not just because of emotion, but because of the philosophy he develops through striving to be the strongest swordsman. Now Zoro does have a philosophical element to his character in swordsmanship, but that really hasn't been developed very much, especially post time skip. The true problem at the core of the rival problem is the swordsmanship problem. Oda hasn't developed swordsmanship as a power system very well, and I think if he did, it would not only benefit Zoro's character and journey, but the overall world building of One Piece. I initially intended on tackling the swordsmanship problem in this video, but it's such a huge topic that I'm going to have to give it its own video. This is like the 4th time in a row that I split this script, but this next video especially is a direct follow up to this one, so be sure to click the end screen here to watch it. And if it hasn't came out yet, and you're also interested in other in-depth dissections of One Piece, be sure to subscribe to see my videos as soon as they come out. And with that, I'll see you in the next dissection video.